the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee.
Dear friends, welcome to all of you. And now we are going to reflect on the family story of David. From chapter 13 onwards up to chapter 20, we find the family history of David narrated. And there are so many events taking place at this time. And we will try to see all these, reflecting a little bit on the important incidents that occurred in the life of David. In the last session, we mentioned that David really suffered as the result of the punishment on him. And we also said there may not have been even a single day he slept peacefully after this incident. But anyhow, we see David is living through his punishments, and under the impact of this punishment, he was in a way being crushed. And what the Lord said, the sword of evil will remain over your house forever. That came to be true, and David experienced it. But the great thing is that he never complained about the suffering, and he never asked God to reduce the intensity of his punishment. If we were in his place, we would have asked God to reduce kindly the intensity of the suffering, the punishment. But we never find him doing it. He suffered as God had said. And this shows he was an ordinary man like ourselves, with his own emotions, sentiments, and he lived through it. And when we go through the following chapters, we'll find David was an ordinary man with ordinary human emotions, sentiments, passions. And not only that, he loved his children so much. Even when they committed crimes, because of his love for the children, he was not even ready to punish them. And as years passed by, we can say things went out of his hand, out of his control. And the children, they asserted themselves over and above even the king. And that's a story, or that is a style of the story that we find from chapter 13 onwards. We had earlier mentioned that sometimes there is a discontinuity in the narrative given in the Bible. And here we find a typical example. In chapter 12, towards the end, we find the story of the conquest of Ammonites, the capture of their capital city, Rabbah. And once that story is over, an entirely different story is narrated now. And this story is about the family of David and his children. And in chapter 13, we find the story of children of David, Amnon and Tamar, Absalom and Amnon. And all these stories are narrated. And here we find some messages too. First of all, let us take the story of Amnon and Tamar. Amnon is the son of David, and Absalom is son of David in another wife. And Absalom had a sister, Tamar. And Amnon fell in love with Tamar and wanted to have her. But she refused, saying, "You ask the permission of the king, and the king will allow us to be married." But he did not wait for it. Instead, he wanted to rape her. And in this incident, what do we find really? It is a kind of grabbing at what belongs to others. And therefore, we can see it is a self-assertive mood of Amnon. And we will see he comes to this stand in his mind because of the evil advice given by his cousin brother, Jonadab. And here we find the cousin brother, he was really giving a treacherous advice to Amnon, how to make her obey. And the poor girl was trapped by Amnon, following the evil advice given by Jonadab. And what is the message from this story? The story has a great message for today's youth, especially. People may feel love for others, but remember the great principle of all: love can wait. And that's an important lesson. It is not that one enters into physical relationship at first. That is not at all the way of the Lord. And practically we can see God wants the human beings love one another in the special way. The marriage relationship is sacred. It is just like a covenant. The covenant between God and Israel, Christ and the church. Following the model of Christ, the covenant relationship between Christ and church in the lives of the youth, there is this covenant relationship of love. And here, what is important? Respect the personality and respect the traditions, the laws. It is not to go after one's own passion, that will be dangerous and it will destroy us. And sometimes the youth, they may feel like following their passion, and some people would go to any extent to get what they desire, and that is what Amnon did, and he got the punishment for the same. In a way, he was killed by Absalom. And another thing that we should take care is about the evil advice given by, or treacherous advice given by Jonadab. We know when somebody asks for a piece of advice from us, we are to give them something that would help them to grow and to lead a life of justice and righteousness, not just to acquire or not just to get what one wants at any cost. Jonadab, he gave the cheating advice, and we find that will never be accepted before the Lord. Therefore, this is a clear message for the present day youth. They are to uphold the principles which are given by the society, by the family, and so on. It is not to go after one's own passion. That is not the purpose, the aim the youth has to achieve. That is what we should remember. Okay, when we go forward, we find another story here, and that is the story of the revenge of Absalom over Amnon. Amnon cheated Tamar, and now we find Absalom cheats Amnon and kills him. Okay, treachery will be repaid by treachery, and that we find very often in the Bible. Therefore, we may think we can succeed by treacherous words and deeds, but it will not last. We will be repaid more or less in the same terms as we give it. Therefore, that's a story of the killing of Amnon by Absalom in treachery. And when Absalom killed Amnon, David became worried about the news, because the news that reached him was that the entire or all the children of David were killed by Absalom. But that was not the case. Only one, and that is Amnon, and that too for his treacherous deed, was killed by Absalom. Of course, we are not to justify the murder, that we can never do. But a lesson that we get from the story is this: if we resort to treachery, we may also get in return treachery, and that we should remember. Okay, that is what Absalom did to Amnon. And fearing that David may punish him, because there is law in the land, life for life is the law, and Absalom flees from the presence of the law, presence of David, and he goes to Geshur, his wife's home. And we know in Geshur he lives, and he does not come back easily, and David does not want to see him, because he had loved Amnon so much. And now Amnon is killed, and Tamar is practically abused, and she is in a very sorrowful plight. Therefore, this is the punishment pronounced on David taking shape in his personal life, in the life of his family. That's what we can say. And when Absalom flees away, naturally we know there are some possible dangers. Absalom is the crown prince. If he keeps away from the palace, that is not good. And therefore, Joab was always keen to bring him back to Jerusalem. But David was not at all willing. He was not ready to forgive the young man. That's what we can say. Okay, now we go to chapter 14. And there we find some stories narrated. First of all, we find a woman coming to David and presenting a case before him. The case goes like this. She had 2 sons. The one son killed the other. And now the leaders of the village, they are after her, demanding that the son who committed the crime is to be killed as a punishment for the crime of murder committed by him. And the woman says now, I am a widow. I had only these 2 children, and one is no more now, and only one more son is there. And if the authorities kill that son also, she is asking David, who will take care of me? She knows that there is the rule, but she is afraid of her own future. And she is asking King David to spare the life of the remaining son. And David said, okay, what you say is granted. And then she changes her color in a way, and she begins to converse with the king. And she says, how can the king now keep away from the son who is to be the crown prince? Why don't he bring Absalom back into the palace? And that is what she asked King David. David immediately sensed that this is the work of Joab, the military chief, because he knew early that Joab was always in the desiring to bring Absalom back to the palace, because he is to be the crown prince, to rule the nation, and therefore he is not to keep away. And this was brought before the king as an issue. And finally we find David agreed to the demand of Joab and this woman of Tekoa. And the result, Absalom was given permission to return to Jerusalem. But a strange thing occurs here. Even though Absalom came back, we see David did not want to see him. And not only that, David was not at all ready to forgive him. And this went on for 3 long years. Father and the son living in neighboring palaces, but they never come to meet together, never talk together. Such a dilemmatic situation. Imagine what a terrible scene it is. And now Absalom had brought him to Jerusalem. Uh, Joab had brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But when Absalom understood that David is not in a mood to talk with him or to reinstate him, he was angry. And he called Joab to come to him. But Joab did not come, because Joab already knew that Absalom wanted Joab to mediate between David and Absalom. And that Joab knew is not going to take place. And therefore, even when he was asked to come, Joab did not go. And what did Absalom do then? It is interesting. He caught hold of almost 100 jackals, foxes, and tied the tails of 2 each together and set fire, wrapped it with a cotton, with a cloth, soaked it in oil, set fire to it, and made them run through the grain fields of Joab. And the result is devastating. The entire fields of Joab were burned by these foxes. And now Joab also gets angry, but he can do nothing against the son of David, because Absalom was such a young man who was ready to do anything. And from this story we get an image, a projection of the young man Absalom. He will go to any extent to get what he wants. He called Joab. Joab did not come, and hence he settles his account with Joab in this way, by setting fire to his field. And this is the nature of the young man Absalom. One who will go to any extent, one who will do whatever he likes to get what he wants. Therefore, here we find practically the attitude of Absalom. That is what we can say. And again, we find Absalom is doing these kinds of things at other times too. In chapter 15, we will find an example. He secured a chariot for himself. The king did not give it, it is said, but he got it by himself and made use of the chariot to show that he is the crown prince. And in chapter 17, we find when Absalom came to Jerusalem and David fled away from Jerusalem for fear of Absalom. And what did Absalom do at that time? He went to the concubines of David, who were left behind by David to take care of the palace. And when Absalom did it, he was conveying an ulterior message. And what is the message? He will go to any extent to get what he wants. He wanted to be the king, and now he approaches even the concubines of his own father. And therefore, we get a terrible image of David's son Absalom. Such is the nature of Absalom that we find in him. Now we go to chapter 15. As we said, David had not given him any special privilege. But even without giving, he secured for himself a chariot. And what is the tradition behind it? Usually, the king rides on a chariot. He goes around the city and goes around through the villages and so on. It is a royal chariot, and it will be drawn by a definite number of horses, maybe 24 or 36 and so on. And if it is 24, then 12 horses will be running ahead of the chariot and 12 behind the chariot. And the soldiers, they are called the escort. They will shout, "Here comes the king, give way for the king," or for the chariot of the king. And that was the way how the kings used the chariots. And usually the crown prince, that means the one who is to become the next king of the land, is also given a privilege like this. But it will not be the same as that of the king. The number of horses may be less, the number of escort soldiers will be less, and so on. But still, he is given a chariot to ride on. And here we understand David did not give a chariot for him. Maybe because David was still angry at the young man for what he did. Anyhow, he secured a chariot for himself and began to use it. And thus, he proclaimed about himself as the future king of the land. He is the so-called crown prince. And he accepted, here we can say, appropriated that title for himself. It is not the king who gave it, but he appropriated the title for himself. Again, we find the nature of the young man Absalom. He devises things in a manner so that he gets what he wants. And whatever be the modality of the action he takes, that does not matter at all for him. And maybe that he is following the principle, the end justifies the means. And that is what we can say about him. And he was also greedy of the throne. And we find another interesting story here. The people of the land, they came to King David for getting judgments on various types of cases. And the people used to gather in the city gate. There will be sufficient place there. And the king will come to the city gate and will hear the cases one by one. And if the king is very busy, sometimes he may not be able to come to the city gate. And then there will be nobody to hear the cases and make or give the judgment. And this was going on. And David was becoming old in a way, and he also had limitations with his age and with his time. And when the people came to the city gate, what did the young man Absalom do? He comes to the city gate ahead of David, and he meets all the people coming to the city, and he will ask each and every one of them, "Hello, my friend, where are you from?" And he will say, "I am from such and such a tribe, coming from such and such a place. And what would Absalom say? Oh, you have a case which is to be judged righteously. But here, there is no one to hear your case, and no one is ready here to give justice for you. And he would further add, if I was the judge, if I was the king of the land, I would have given justice for you. And naturally, the people thought, if Absalom were our king. And again we find, when somebody comes from the tribe of Judah, it is a tribe of David. And then what he will do? He will call them, and then he will give a big hug for them, and then say, oh my dear, you are suffering because of your case. But what to say? Nobody is there to hear your case. And if I were in charge, things would have been different. And by speaking in this way, we read in the text, Absalom stole the hearts of the people. And they really thought, if Absalom were our king, it would have benefited us. Okay, that's the way Absalom behaved, and he wanted to practically go forward. And then we will find Absalom devises his own plan to usurp the throne of David. That is, to capture the throne of David. And David is to be David is to flee away from the capital. And then Absalom comes to Jerusalem, declares himself to be the king of the land. David escapes for fear of death, and so on. And this story we will narrate in the next session. Okay, thank you.
All-powerful God, give us the wisdom to discover you, the intelligence to understand you, the diligence to seek after you, the patience to wait for you, eyes to behold you, and a life to proclaim you, through the power of the Spirit of Jesus, our Lord. Amen.